For the first time since 1923, the UK now gearing up for a Christmas-time election. With Parliament hopelessly deadlocked over Brexit and the threat of a no-deal crash-out avoided, at least for now, the Leader of the Opposition agreeing to a December date for the vote. We'll review what's been another roller coaster session in the Commons, with the Opposition set to force a tweak in the snap polls date. We'll also ask what a December election means and who will win it. The Tories have a close to 10-point lead on Labour, but as Theresa May discovered at her own expense last time around, a lot can happen in 6 weeks. Never before has the electorate been so volatile in the UK. Why is that? How is Brexit disrupting the two-party system of old in the world's longest-running parliamentary democracy? And what happens next? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at the implications of a December general election. And joining us from Brussels, Seb Dance, Labour member of the European Parliament representing London. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Jeremy Stubbs is the president of British Conservatives in Paris. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you.
And we welcome back Victoria Collins, who is a parliamentary candidate for Poole.
Exactly, yeah.
For the Liberal Democrats.
Absolutely, yes.
Welcome.
Thank you.
John Mellon, co-director of the British Election Study, where academics have been monitoring every vote across the channel since 1964. You're in New York City this Tuesday. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and on Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Yeah, with no deal off the table and the rest of the opposition now in favor of a snap poll, it was Jeremy Corbyn's turn to speak.
Election, we're going to go out there with a very strong message of how we transform our society to end inequality and injustice and deal with the devastating poverty that so many people face. We always said we wanted an election, we do want an election, but we wanted no deal to be taken off the table. We've now had confirmation from all 28 EU member states that no deal is off the table, so we're going to go out there with the biggest campaign this party has ever mounted.
Now, earlier in the Commons, Seb Dance, when Jeremy Corbyn got up to speak, there were members from his own party who got up to question whether or not it was a good idea having an early election. How divided is Labour over the idea of this snap poll?
I think there's understandably a lot of disquiet about the sequencing of all of this. Ultimately, and I remain of the view, that it has been a long-held view in many circles within the Labour Party that actually the best way of dealing with Brexit is to have a referendum beforehand in order that you get the question resolved before we move on to a general election where there will be many, many issues at stake. But I mean, ultimately, a general election was going to happen at some point. And perhaps it's true that there wasn't sufficient support in Parliament for a people's vote. I question that. I think probably we were moving to a position where there was. But anyway, that's by the by. An election was always going to happen. It was simply a question of when. And if this sequencing hasn't been sorted out, it's less than ideal. But most things in this Brexit process are far from ideal.
Do you get the sense that, well, the election itself is going to be that second referendum?
Well, it shouldn't be, as for the reasons I outlined. I mean, there are many things that are at discussion, that are at stake in a general election that impact every aspect of everyday life. Brexit's just one of those, but obviously it is the single most important issue facing the country at the moment, even if most people don't rate it as the single most important issue facing the country. And so, yes, in many respects it will be. If the Conservatives win this election, then there will be a very hard Brexit, probably on the 31st of January, on the terms that Boris Johnson has set, and that will be devastating for the country. It will be very bad, I think, also for the wider European economy. But if Boris Johnson doesn't win this election, then obviously all things become possible, including, I hope, a people's vote on what happens next.
Yeah, both sides of the House divided during parliamentary debate earlier. Labour MPs, as we were saying, stood up to differ with Jeremy Corbyn on the triggering of that election. The pro-Remain Evening Standard newspaper, its front page headline, agrees it's a mistake to hold this snap election before you have closure on Brexit. Do you see the point there, Victoria Collins?
I mean, I absolutely do. And actually, I agree with Seb in many ways that I also, and the Lib Dems, wanted a people's vote first. But we, for example, we tabled 17 amendments for a people's vote that were not supported by Parliament. And you say that no deal is off the table, but actually the risk of a no deal has just been extended in that 31st of January, if we don't have the deal which has passed through Parliament, there is still a risk of a no deal. So actually we're kind of cornered into say, well, if after 17 amendments, the Labour Party, the Conservative Party are not going to support that people's vote, then perhaps an election is the best way forward. But I definitely think a people's vote is the best way forward.
Well, there'd only be no deal if the Conservatives win the general election.
Well, if they win and it's voted through, if they win, then it's what Seb said, that they could push through potentially their withdrawal agreement. But I mean, the Lib Dems want to stop Brexit. We don't even want to have Boris Johnson's Brexit deal. We want to stop Brexit because we believe that's better for the United Kingdom. But all kinds of things can happen, which means that a no-deal Brexit is still a possibility until the 31st of January if we don't resolve this issue as soon as possible.
Jeremy Stubbs, each camp divided. The day began with the former Chancellor of the Exchequer, Philip Hammond, lashing out at what Seb Dance spoke about a minute ago, which is the sequencing of it all. How torn apart is the Conservative Party going into this campaign? What with the whip withdrawn, right, from those who are for a softer Brexit or pro-Remain?
I think we're probably less divided on this issue than Labour. We've talked here about the sequencing. There are times when you just can't choose the sequencing. And I think most people have accepted that there must be a general election. We've also heard there people talking about no deal. There's actually a deal on the table that's sitting there waiting to be ratified. The trouble is that Parliament can't make up its mind, therefore we must change Parliament. And Parliament will decide one way or the other, once the people have decided one way or the other, who will have the majority in Parliament.
How do you feel personally when you see, for instance, earlier, Kenneth Clark, one of the elder statesmen, if you will, of the Commons, get up and really tear into Boris Johnson?
Well, it's not the first time we've seen such arguments going on within the party or within other parties. As we heard just now, Brexit means extraordinary times, extraordinary measures. We've just got to weather the storm. And the only way I can see of weathering the storm is to sail straight into the heart of an election.
All right, those divisions within parties we discussed earlier in Labour, in the Conservatives, also felt inside the normally disciplined Scottish National Party. Its leader in the Commons, Ian Blackford, says he's squarely in favour of that early election, but not MP Angus MacNeil, who told BBC Scotland on Monday that the SNP has obviously nothing to fear in an election, certainly wouldn't have anything to fear in 6 months' time in Scotland, but the thing we've got to fear is we have Boris Johnson in place for 5 years with a big majority. Fortunately, John Mellon has brought his crystal ball with him to New York and will tell us what the numbers say.
So certainly at the moment, the Conservatives have a substantial polling lead over Labour, but the thing we've really got to bear in mind here is that there is so much volatility in how voters are choosing at the moment. And this is a long-running thing. We've gone from about 1 in 10 voters switching parties in the 1960s to now it's really quite usual for 30, even 40% of voters to switch between elections. And this means that even a big lead, like 10 percentage points, can fall away really quite rapidly because voters are willing to change their minds and go with different parties. So there's a risk on all sides here.
Yeah, your surveys show that between 2010 and 2017, 49%, almost half the electorate, didn't vote for the same party 2 elections in a row. Why is that?
I mean, part of it is this long-term shift away from the major parties, from having one lifetime party you vote for every single time. This is a long trend that's been going on election after election for decades. But then you go and layer Brexit on top of this, and suddenly you have people making choices they never would have thought they would ever make. People who've voted Labour for a long time in a row, switching to the Conservatives over Brexit, and voters going the other way as well. you have more voters than ever before switching between the major parties, which used to be a thing that never really happened, and now it's happened quite a bit.
Now it's happened quite a bit, and you get the sense that this issue, Brexit, has become more important than political parties. You're in the United States where they're having an election next year, and there's the sense that Donald Trump is more important than the two political parties when voters make up their minds. Certainly when you look at the midterm results from 2018, are we heading towards a future where single issues matter more than parties?
So I think in the US case, it's a little bit different because although Donald Trump did make some people who'd never really voted for Republicans before switch, you still had actually huge amounts of stability in the US there. It was really just those marginal voters in the couple of key states that switched. Whereas in the UK, it really is the majority of the electorate who are willing to consider switching every time. And they're willing to do it on the basis of things such as Brexit. So the UK case is actually much more volatile than the US, and other issues such as Brexit can come in and take people away from where they've stuck forever.
Seb Dance, what conclusions do you draw when you see you've had high-profile resignations from your party, you've had purges inside the Conservatives? What does that tell you?
Well, it tells me that Brexit is in danger of breaking the British political system. I think, frankly, I mean, when you boil it all down, I think the rhetoric, when it meets the reality, it creates problems that nobody could probably work out where we end up. I mean, I think in this election, it is all to play for. You will have obviously had the precedent of 2017. I don't think it'll be the same in the sense that I think the two leaders of the two main parties are in a very different position than were Theresa May and Jeremy Corbyn. But nonetheless, this issue of volatility is so crucial that, honestly, it's impossible to see where this ends up. And then one really big flashing red light I would have if I were a Tory strategist would be to look at the European election results and the main swing in non-metropolitan England, which was from the Conservative Party to the Liberal Democrats. And that would tell me as a Tory strategist that there is something very, very significant out there to be wary of. But, we'll see. This election will yield many surprises. I've no doubt about that.
And does the fact that it's taking place in December matter? I know the British like to have their elections in the spring.
Yeah, there's a very good reason for that. I mean, the time zone that we've just shifted onto means that it gets dark at 3:30, which is not ideal. Certainly when you're out and about knocking on doors and trying to speak to voters in the pitch black, it's not pleasant. Daylight hours, even in the south of England in December, are around about 8 hours. When you get to the north of Scotland, it's even less, 6.5 to 7 hours. So it's far from ideal. But again, we are where we are, and it might be yet another factor in an election that is sure to throw up many surprises.
So not many daylight hours, Victoria Collins, but will that be offset by the fact that people seem energized, right?
There's definitely all to play for. I mean, we talk about Labour and Conservatives, but Jo Swinson, the leader of the Liberal Democrats, is standing there as also with the ambition of being the next Prime Minister. And like what Seb said, things are changing. So, for example, Poole, which is my constituency, that for 139 years that's been a Conservative seat. And we are knocking on doors and we're finding that people are actually thinking about changing to the Lib Dems, but not just because of Brexit actually, but also because of the NHS and because of the way that Boris Johnson conducted himself about proroguing Parliament.
Is campaigning in December different from campaigning in the spring?
It is, absolutely. I mean, it does take more to get people out. That's the first thing. But there's another thing as well we haven't mentioned yet, which is the date. And if we talk about, I don't know if you're going to come on to that, but for example, 12th of December, you're talking about when students are moving. And that's why that's important. So there's a lot of different factors to take into account, which are a different set of circumstances than a May election. And we need to think about that in a whole kind of wholesome way, if you're in.
So what are you suggesting?
Well, we're suggesting that if we have to go through an election on the 9th of December.
9th of December, because people didn't quite get it. 9th of December, 12th of December. Do you agree with Victoria Collins? It does make a difference, particularly because that is the period when universities break up?
Well, the government wanted it to be the 12th to leave enough time to comfortably pass legislation concerning Northern Ireland and its spending arrangements. And that'll have to be done double quick. I'm sure that some date between the 9th and the 12th would be chosen. I'm fairly confident because I think that despite the colour of his robe, Father Christmas is a conservative figure and there's a likely victory there. But what I think is most important for us is how the first past the post system will work. Theresa May, despite it has to be said, a very poor campaign in 2017, got the largest Conservative victory in the popular vote since 1983. So the way things are set up with the old-fashioned system is not necessarily this time always doing us a lot of good.
You're broaching an important topic, Jeremy Stubbs, which is that of tactical voting and how it plays out. I want to put it to our panel. Unfortunately, we have to take a very quick break. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. We were hoping for closure on Brexit. It'll have to come for now through the ballot box. What with a December election on the cards, we're talking about it with Seb Dance, Labour member of the European Parliament, who joins us from Brussels. Welcome back to Jeremy Stubbs, president of the British Conservatives in Paris. Victoria Collins, who is with the Liberal Democrats, parliamentary candidate in the Poole constituency, and John Millen, co-director of the British Elections Study, who's with us from New York City today. The Prime Minister making it clear in the Commons Boris Johnson's tack is to make his gamble of an early election seem like a sure thing, with the claim that Labour is running scared.
All they want to do is procrastinate. They don't want to deliver Brexit on October the 31st, on November the 31st, even on January the 31st.
John Mellon, what kind of tone can we expect from this campaign?
Well, judging by what we've seen so far, I think it's going to be a very polarized campaign with people making pretty impassioned pleas and quite negative assertions about the other party on both sides. And voters are increasingly becoming polarized as well. A lot of voters on the Remain and the Leave side are endorsing the most extreme positions on each one, either wanting no-deal Brexit or a very hard Brexit versus perhaps even having Remain without a second referendum. So the centre of the public has kind of fallen out while the voters have moved more and more extreme, and the politicians are reflecting that too.
Let's pick up on that. If we look at the poll of polls as compiled by Politico, you can certainly feel a Boris Johnson effect, the support for the Tories climbing in that survey after his election as Conservative leader and rising steadily up to now. Seb Dance, Boris Johnson, a leader for a campaign in polarized times?
Well, there's an epitaph for you. Yes, I suspect that the whole polarized nature of our politics is something that he would feed off. The question, though, is not so much how well is he doing versus Jeremy Corbyn. The question really ought to be how well is he doing versus prime ministers who have come in at a similar juncture, and the reality is his ratings are actually pretty poor. The problem for the Labour Party
but you will concede he'll be a better campaigner than Theresa May was.
Oh, yeah, no, absolutely, no question. I mean, that wouldn't be difficult. But yes, he will almost certainly be a better campaigner than Theresa May, but she was appalling. But that doesn't necessarily mean that his message and his campaign style will win. As I say, the overarching element that will affect the result is the volatility. I think that is by far the single most important factor in this election. And his suitability or otherwise for adversarial politics, I think, will actually play second fiddle.
All right, so we're braced for a polarized field. And we have breaking news, Jeremy Stubbs, with the Conservative spokesperson saying that 10 of the 21 Conservative lawmakers, who you'll recall were effectively expelled last month, have now been readmitted to the party. Is the tent going to get bigger again?
Yes, I mean, we've been expecting this readmission for some time now, in fact. It was really a question of how many. And I think that people are anxious to repair wounds.
Do you wish it had been all 21?
Well, some of them have decided to retire anyway, so we're not going to see them. It's not yet over. We may still get others back. But we understand that this is a question where people are going to vote according to their consciences, and some of them are very, very resolute in what they've decided, and we must respect that. But it's certainly the case that all of these tensions we've been invoking have a counterpart, which is also a desire, sometimes repressed, to actually make things up again, to build the bridges, to come together. I think the main thing people want Brexit to be over and done with for is so that we can come together again. Whether that's possible, I don't know, but there are signs that it could be.
Victoria Collins?
Responses to that? To the fact...
Because we heard there John Mellon saying, brace yourself for a very polarized campaign, and you're hearing Jeremy Stubbs saying, well, maybe in the end, people do want reconciliation, a return to a more tempered Britain.
Well, absolutely. I agree with that. I do. And and I think, and that's what I'm also hearing on the doorstep. People are tired of that kind of inflammatory language, the way that we're tearing each other apart. And there's a lot of people inside and outside the UK who are looking at our democracy and feeling absolutely ashamed and saddened by it. And that's where I think we do need a kind of forward looking where there's more grown-up politics and to bring us all back together and start dealing with the real issues.
John Mellon, what's a better vote getter? Being polarizing and provocative, or being conciliatory?
So the big problem here is that the Brexit issue is, of course, looming so large. And on both sides, Labour and the Conservatives have a potential challenger who's taking a more extreme position than them on each side of the Brexit division. So the Conservatives are competing with Nigel Farage's Brexit party, who are advocating no deal. And Labour are competing with the Liberal Democrats, who are advocating revoking Article 50 and not having Brexit at all, at least in some circumstances. And so that is going to generally push all the parties towards the extremes because they're mainly competing within one group of voters on their own side, and being conciliatory potentially goes and loses them those voters. So all the incentives are pushing people towards the extremes at the moment. And that's the way it seems to be going right now, at least. And
that brings us to the question we were mentioning just before the break, which is that of tactical voting. Now, today, John, it's become much more sophisticated how you measure which way it's going in a constituency. Do you expect it to be easier to convince voters to vote tactically?
I think voters are going to try to vote tactically at ever higher rates because Brexit is this big, important, to some extent irreversible issue that in other elections, if you lose the election to a party you don't like as much, there'll be another election in 5 years, back when we had elections every 5 years, and you can reverse it and get different policy. But Brexit is much more irreversible, much more long-term, and voters will be reacting to that and trying to vote tactically. The difficulty is knowing what is the tactical choice, because parties on every side are not going to agree on that. The Lib Dems will be saying, we are only the only party that can deliver Remain properly, and Labour will be saying, well, we're the party that has the long-term base here. And those arguments will go on in every constituency and at the national level. And it's unclear at the moment whether all the voters will manage to coordinate to vote tactically together in a sensible way, or if they'll try to vote tactically and then it will fail and they'll still end up splitting the vote on their side and losing out in terms of the first-past-the-post system.
Seb Dance, it is first-past-the-post. What do you say? You're a Remainer. You want the UK to remain in the European Union. What do you say if you have a friend who lives in a constituency where the outgoing MP is Labour but is for Brexit, would you tell that person vote Labour anyways, or would you tell them to vote for a pro-Remain candidate?
Well, in this hypothetical situation, we're talking about a very, very small number of Labour MPs who are pro-Brexit. I mean, if it was for a member of the Labour Party, a Labour MP, who has said that they would vote for the deal.
Well, there's a whole host of constituencies in the north of the country where that's the case.
Well, no. There's a lot of constituencies that voted Leave that are Labour constituencies, but the Labour voters are Remain voters. And there are many Labour MPs who represent Leave constituencies who have taken it upon themselves rightly to take a leadership role in explaining why they believe remaining in the European Union is the best option. And obviously in those circumstances, people should vote Labour. But I think this tactical vote issue is one that will be incredibly prevalent in this election. You've got to remember, with first past the post, parties can rack up huge numbers in safe seats, and that's exactly what Theresa May did in 2017. If you just look at her vote share, it was extremely good. And she racked up enormous amounts of Conservative votes in Conservative areas, but in the marginals, she failed. And I think in those marginal seats, that's where the tactical voting issue will become prevalent. And I would just say to everyone, if your priority is to stop Brexit, if your priority is to have a different course for our country that remains as part of the European family, it is essential that Boris Johnson does not win this general election.
Essential that Boris Johnson doesn't win the general election, and there's still that ambiguity that hangs over the leader of your party, Jeremy Corbyn. We heard him even today when he was calling for that general election. He was talking more about the domestic bread and butter issues before putting Brexit forth.
Yeah, and I think many in our party would prefer to talk about those bread and butter issues. In fact, even I would prefer to talk about those bread and butter issues, even though I live and breathe Brexit every single moment of the day, it seems. I'm utterly, utterly sick of it because I think it's a divisive, horrible thing that has happened, and I want shot of it. But I don't want shot of it to get it done, because I understand that getting it done in the sense of passing the withdrawal agreement just means yet more Brexit. It means years and years and years of talking about nothing else. And I think there is obvious Brexit fatigue, not just in the electorate, but within my party and other parties as well, and that's why I suspect Jeremy wants to talk about domestic issues. Ultimately, I think probably the electorate want to talk about bread and butter issues, and this returns back to our first question as to why the sequencing is so important. But we are where we are, and Brexit is going to have to be a huge part of this election, and that's why, if you want to stop Brexit, you have to prioritise whatever it takes to ensure that Boris Johnson does not win this election.
People want to talk about bread and butter issues, but the reason the Liberal Democrats have surged is because you're resolutely pro-Remain. It's on the doorstep. Are they talking about those other issues, or are they talking about Brexit?
No, in all honesty, they are talking about other issues. I mean, I myself joined in 2016 because of Brexit, but actually since then, I've always kind of had those liberal values, but the more and more I know about the policy, that's why I've stayed and come to this position. I think that's the same for a lot of people. But actually, the interesting thing, I mean, we were looking again at this, what were the key issues in the area, and Brexit isn't the main issue in every area. Every local area has their problems, their kind of impact, whether it's on education, whether it's their schools, that people still care about, and they're talking about that. So it's not just about Brexit. But that's why it would have been good to have a people's vote first on Brexit. But if we're forced into a general election, it's to try and cover all of that. But also, obviously, as Lib Dems, be clear where we stand, in that it would be clearly a vote to stop Brexit if you voted for us.
So Seb Dance describing the Brexit fatigue in the UK, Brexit fatigue where he is in Brussels as well. And let's remember, a December vote with no Brexit closure in sight. Well, on paper, that means the UK will have to designate a European commissioner before December 1st. That's when the new EU Commission takes its seat.
Indeed, if after the 1st of November, and there are steps to do so, this is not a given. There might be an extension, and there might be, and the UK is still in the European Union. Then, of course, I would ask the UK to send a commissioner.
Jeremy Stubbs, should Boris Johnson send an EU commissioner to Brussels?
Well, with the new chumminess that exists between Boris Johnson and the EU, he, I think, will do whatever will rock the boat the least at the present time, and I don't think anyone needs any boat rocking, as it were.
But if your party's trying to win the votes from the Brexit party, what kind of signal will it send? If he does send a commissioner?
I think it probably would be interpreted in all kinds of ways, so whether he does it or he doesn't, it probably won't make a lot of difference. It's true that for the Conservative Party, we need, as it were, to outflank the Brexit party with the message that if they want Brexit, their electors should vote Conservative, because if they vote for the Brexit party, it'll simply divide the vote and probably put others into power. We still have one other secret weapon, of course, which is the leader of the opposition, who works tirelessly for us, I think. The popularity of the Labour leader is, at the moment at least, a great asset to us compared to the popularity of Boris Johnson.
John Mellon, is that true?
So certainly Jeremy Corbyn is pretty historically unpopular at the moment. But it is worth bearing in mind he also started historically unpopular at the start of the 2017 campaign, and his popularity actually increased greatly during the campaign, and Theresa May's fell. So we don't necessarily know that what the voters think of the leaders right now will reflect how they feel about them on election day. But certainly at the moment, Jeremy Corbyn's ratings don't look great for Labour.
Now, this splintering of the vote that we've seen, upending politics, and not just in the UK, which in Spain, they're returning to the polls for the third time in 4 years, November 10th. In Germany, a grand coalition is on the brink. And when you look at the makeup of the current UK Parliament, where the Conservatives, well, never had an outright majority, there's now very much, John Mellon, perhaps the potential for a coalition government. Is it really the end of the old two-party system, or should we call it the two-party and a bit system?
So at the moment, it's relatively two-party again, at least compared to 2015 in the vote shares. But yeah, there's very real possibility that we'll have a large number of MPs outside of the two major parties again this time. Very possible that you'll have a large Lib Dem showing, a large SNP showing. So I think calling it a two-party system is a bit outdated now in Britain. It's certainly a system that still recently has revolved around the two parties, but it has the potential all the time for other parties to come in and be major players, both electorally and then in terms of potential coalitions or agreements about governing.
And what's the most likely scenario if no party wins an outright majority? Who's the best match, if you will?
So it will probably break down again on the Leave Remain lines, given that that is such an important issue through Parliament. It's unlikely that you would get a grand coalition because it's hard to see what the common ground for Labour and Conservatives could possibly be. And the Lib Dems, again, I think their share of the vote hugely crashed in 2015 after they went into coalition. And it was a shock that they really didn't recover from until more or less now. And I think they'll avoid as much as possible having any association with the Conservatives again. Even if that was the only viable governing structure, you'd probably get another election.
So, Victoria Collins, would the Lib Dems be amenable to a coalition with Labour?
We absolutely not for Boris Johnson and the Conservatives, and we would not be in coalition with Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party either. That is absolutely where we stand.
Not Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party? Is that to say if Labour had a different leader, you'd agree to it?
Right now, as it stands in Parliament, we would not be in coalition with any other party.
Seb
the
Dance?
two major parties.
I'm hurt. I mean, every party.
You seem very nice.
every party goes in. Yeah, every party goes into an election saying we will not enter into coalition talks with X, Y, or Z. I mean, that is part of the course of an election campaign. I think if you start off on a campaign footing saying, oh yeah, no, we'll compromise on this and we'll make arrangements with you on that, then you are already diluting your core message. And I think that's right. But I have to say, the two-party system, wouldn't it be a great thing, actually, if there were more coalitions in UK politics, if there were more opportunities for smaller parties to actually have a voice and a say in the way things are run? I have no doubt whatsoever that a minority-led government could not lead us out of the European Union in future, were it to be a case where you have to seek more consensus and more views, and crucially, govern in the interests of the entire UK, not just one constituent part of it. I think
Is
we would
first
have a very
past the
different
post
country and
outdated?
we'd be all the better for it. Yes, I think it is. I didn't actually used to believe that before I came here as an MEP. I was a staunch defender of first past the post. I thought it delivered kind of majoritarian governments that were roughly in line with the mood of the people. I've come to completely change that view being here. I think that working with others works. I think that when you find consensus on issues, it produces better laws and better regulation. And it's less adversarial. I think it's a better system.
Do you agree with that, Jeremy Stubbs? You who lives in France, where we have a system that's a little bit different from a lot of Europe, with 2 rounds by district voting.
Well, every system has its virtues, but and I acknowledge the part played by the Lib Dems in the coalition that brought us out of the crisis, and they did very well. I thank them, and it was under their pressure that we had a decision about the voting system by, dare I say it, a referendum, I think in 2011, which was negative. And I'm not sure if anyone wants to go deciding new things via referenda for a while yet. So whatever we may say about the current system...
But do you agree that electoral...
There's an admission it was a mistake.
Do you agree that electoral reform is needed and that first past the post has seen its day?
I think the most immediate electoral reform would be boundary changes that would even up things in the first past the post system. But those boundary changes, I'm afraid, recommended by the Commission could not be brought in time for this election.
Seb Dance, there's one reform amendment that wasn't put forth, at least I don't think so, which is people like Jeremy Stubbs here, who live outside of the UK for many years, if more than 15, they won't be able to vote. You're saying this will be the last election where you can?
The last, just in December.
Okay. Can't that be changed? Where many people watching us, they did not have a vote in 2016.
Yeah, I hope it will be changed. Obviously, this election, I understand that the amendments haven't been selected. It's a bit much to say that Parliament can change the electoral law in the case of one afternoon, but I think this is a discussion that we should have. I think that people who have lived outside the UK for more than 15 years shouldn't automatically lose the vote, particularly in the case where they don't have a vote in the country where they live. I mean, they're effectively being disenfranchised in both jurisdictions. And I definitely think that European Union citizens should be able to vote in a general election, not least, of course, because Commonwealth citizens can vote, but also, of course, they live, pay and work taxes and pay taxes in the United Kingdom. And as taxpayers, I think they should have the vote. No taxation without representation.
All right, we'll leave it there. Unfortunately, we're out of time. Seb Dance, I want to thank you for joining us from Brussels. John Mellon in New York. I also want to thank Victoria Collins, Jeremy Stubbs. Stay with us. Media Watch is next. And we say hello to we say hello to James Creedon.
Hi, Francois.
James, why are you sighing?
Because it's really tiresome trying to dig up tweets on Brexit, but I'll do my best, okay? And there's live blogs as well, trying to keep track of everything that's happening. So this is the Telegraph live blog and the various votes that are taking place on, well, we saw that 16-year-olds EU nationals, that failed.
Everyone complains about it.
Yes.
And yet they watch.
They do, I suppose. They, keep the drama keeps on going.
What does that tell you?
But on this particular issue, you were just talking about it right now. There's been a lot of comment about that online as well. Whether or not EU nationals should be allowed to participate in. So various opinions being expressed on that online. There is no precedent for EU nationals to vote in foreign general elections. It's a ridiculous, cynical attempt at gerrymandering, says one comment. Then you have the equal and opposite opinion being expressed? All of this comments on articles about this. No, it was gerrymandering to deny EU nationals who have lived, worked and paid billions in taxes and had families here in the UK for decades a vote in something that directly affects them. And I think there was even a comment echoing exactly what we just heard there, no taxation without representation. So a lot of opinions being expressed on that. What else do we have? Donald Tusk has just tweeted, "To my British friends, the EU 27 has formally adopted the extension. It may be the last one. Please make the best of it. I also want to say goodbye to you as my mission here is coming to an end. I will keep my fingers crossed." Comments on that indicating the extent to which he has been a polarising figure as well. Don't cross your fingers. In other words, you might think you've been appeasing, but you've been a hand grenade. You will not be missed.
Hand grenade? Wow.
You will not be missed on this island. But just below that, the equal and opposite opinion. You've been a true friend to us and better than we ever deserved. Thank you and kudos. Not at all a divided island right now. What else do we have? This was the parody Boris Johnson response. "Thank you, and I hope you find it easier to leave the EU than I have." Now, elsewhere, obviously, people already sort of gearing up for a general election, and if Donald Tusk is polarising, so is Boris Johnson. And so this is one tweet that I thought sort of summed up the level of strong feeling on each side. "It hurts my brain to listen to him. It's a relentless stream of distortions. Please vote him out. I can't take it anymore." So I think you have a lot of that online. People just really exhausted by how long the process is taking. Others calling on young people to get out and vote if they don't want to see the current government continue. This is Dave Keating, who often reports for us here on France 24, picking up on something that is also, I suppose, the talking points going towards the vote. He's tired of hearing Conservative commentators say that Boris Johnson got the EU to open the withdrawal agreement when they said they wouldn't, and he's pointing out that the EU said they couldn't based on the UK's red lines, which then did shift with the customs border being put on the Irish Sea. So that's a comment on all sorts of elements of the debate. I thought that this was an interesting one in terms of searching for a date. If the election is agreed for December the 11th, Parliament will dissolve on the night of November the 5th, which is Guy Fawkes night.
There you go.
Which is bonfire night. And it reminded me of two satirical articles I've seen recently. Government advisors baffled as Boris Johnson's pants keeps catching on fire. And that was, that's News Thump, which is satire, obviously. And this was just after the Scottish Supreme Court ruling. And it reminded me of another satirical article, which I'll finish with. Entire government to be replaced by a pair of pants on fire, which I think that's US version.
Right.
It's not connected directly, but satire seems to be merging with the news these days, Francois. So I thought it might be an appropriate way to end.
Looks like the
segment.
cover of a Pink Floyd album. Many thanks, James Creedon. I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.